The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare across the wood-paneled walls of Courtroom 7A in the Hamilton County Superior Court. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what should have been a routine civil hearing. But nothing about this day would prove routine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Judge Harrison Blake adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and glanced at the docket with barely concealed irritation. At 62, Judge Blake had presided over this courtroom for nearly 15 years, building a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who ran his court with military precision. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his black robes pressed to crisp perfection, and his demeanor carried the weight of a man who had never been challenged, never been questioned, and certainly never been wrong. The case before him was Miller versus Grandview Development Corporation, a property dispute involving a homeless encampment that had been forcibly removed from a piece of contested land 6 months earlier. The development company claimed clear ownership and the right to remove trespassers. The plaintiffs, represented by a small legal aid organization, argued that the land had been illegally seized from its rightful owners and that the homeless individuals had been victims of an unlawful eviction. Judge Blake had already made up his mind. He'd seen enough of these cases to know how they ended. Bleeding heart lawyers trying to make names for themselves by championing lost causes, while legitimate businesses were forced to wade through endless red tape. The sooner he could dismiss this frivolous lawsuit, the sooner he could move on to cases that actually mattered. "Your Honor," said Amanda Chen, the earnest young attorney representing the plaintiffs. Her suit was off the rack, her briefcase scarred from years of use, but her voice carried unwavering conviction. "I'd like to call our first witness, Thomas Mitchell." Judge Blake barely looked up from his papers. "Proceed, counselor, but let's keep this moving. I have a full docket today." The courtroom doors creaked open, and a figure shuffled forward down the center aisle. Thomas Mitchell was in his late 50s, though the streets had aged him beyond his years. His gray beard was neatly trimmed despite his circumstances, and his clothes, a faded brown jacket over a clean white shirt, showed evidence of careful maintenance. His boots were worn but polished, and he carried himself with a posture that spoke of discipline learned long ago and never forgotten. As Thomas approached the witness stand, a ripple of whispers moved through the sparse gallery. Most of the spectators were court personnel, a few journalists covering local issues, and several residents from the displaced encampment who had managed to take time off from their daily survival to attend the hearing. "State your name for the record," the court clerk instructed. "Thomas Andrew Mitchell," he replied, his voice clear and steady despite the hostile environment. Amanda Chen stepped forward, her legal pad filled with carefully prepared questions. "Mr. Mitchell, were you living in the Riverside Park encampment when it was demolished last April?" "Yes, ma'am, I was." "And how long had you been living there?" Thomas paused, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "About 8 months, give or take." Judge Blake's pen scratched impatiently across his notepad. He had little patience for sob stories, and even less for the parade of witnesses who would undoubtedly follow, each with their own tale of woe designed to tug at heartstrings rather than address legal facts. "Mr. Mitchell," Amanda continued, her tone calm but insistent, "can you describe the conditions of your removal from the property?" Thomas straightened slightly, his eyes focusing on a point just above the attorney's head, as if he were seeing something else entirely, something far from this sterile courtroom. "It was approximately 0600 hours when they arrived. 3 bulldozers, 2 dump trucks, and about a dozen workers in hard hats. No warning beyond the notices they'd posted 48 hours prior." Judge Blake's head snapped up at the military precision of the timeline. Something about the way the witness had said 0600 hours, rather than 6 in the morning, caught his attention, though not in a way that generated sympathy. "And what happened to your personal belongings?" Amanda asked. "Most were destroyed," Thomas replied, factually. "I managed to save a backpack with some clothes and a few personal items. The rest, sleeping bag, tarp, camping equipment, books, all of it went into the dumpsters. Among those personal items that were destroyed, was there anything of particular significance to you? Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There were some photographs and a few documents for my military service. Judge Blake leaned forward, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Mr. Mitchell, let's cut to the chase here. You were trespassing on private property, correct? Amanda Chen started to object. Your Honor, I'm conducting the examination. I'll ask the questions I deem relevant, Counselor. Judge Blake's tone brooked no argument. He turned his attention back to Thomas, his expression of barely restrained disdain. Well, Mr. Mitchell, you were living illegally on land that didn't belong to you, were you not? Thomas met the judge's gaze steadily. Sir, with respect, the ownership of that land is the subject of this litigation. The Riverside Park area was originally deeded to the city in 1943 as a memorial park for I'm not interested in ancient history, Judge Blake interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. I'm interested in facts. The fact is, you had no legal right to be camping there. The fact is, you were given notice to vacate. The fact is, you chose to ignore that notice. Is that correct?
The courtroom had fallen silent, except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Amanda Chen clutched her legal pad, her prepared questions suddenly seeming inadequate for the hostile environment her client now faced. Your Honor, Thomas said carefully, I believe there are relevant circumstances that— Circumstances? Judge Blake's voice rose slightly, and a thin smile played at the corners of his mouth. Mr. Mitchell, I've been on this bench for 15 years. I've heard every sob story, every excuse, every relevant circumstance you can imagine. The bottom line is responsibility, personal responsibility. He leaned back in his chair, clearly warming to his subject. The sparse audience in the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that something uncomfortable was about to unfold. You mentioned military service, Judge Blake continued, his tone taking on a mocking edge. Well, if that's true, then you should understand discipline. You should understand following orders. You should understand that actions have consequences. Thomas remained silent, his hands still folded, his posture straight despite the verbal assault. And yet here you are, the judge pressed on, asking this court to feel sorry for you because a private company exercised its legal rights to clear trespassers from its property. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, what exactly did you do in the military? Were you taught that it's acceptable to ignore legal notices? Were you taught that other people's property rights don't matter as long as you have nowhere else to go? The questions hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Amanda Chen half rose from her chair, her face flushed with indignation. But Thomas caught her eye and shook his head, almost imperceptibly. This was his battle to fight. Sir, Thomas said, his voice maintaining its steady calm, I served in the United States Army for 22 years. I understand discipline, and I understand following orders. I also understand that sometimes circumstances require a man to make difficult choices. Judge Blake scoffed audibly. Difficult choices? You chose to live in a tent on someone else's property rather than take responsibility for your situation. You chose to ignore legal notices rather than find legitimate housing. Those weren't difficult choices, Mr. Mitchell. Those were selfish choices. The judge's voice was gaining momentum now, feeding off its own righteous indignation. He had found his rhythm, his theme for the morning's entertainment. I see men like you come through this courtroom regularly, men who claim military service when it's convenient, who wave the flag when they want sympathy, but who can't be bothered to contribute to society in any meaningful way. It's frankly insulting to the men and women who actually served their country with honor. A shocked silence settled over the courtroom. Amanda Chen's mouth fell open slightly, and even the court reporter's fingers seemed to hesitate over her keys. In the gallery, several of the displaced residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the journalists present suddenly found themselves witness to what was quickly becoming more than a routine hearing. Thomas Mitchell, however, remained perfectly still. His blue eyes, the same pale blue that had once scanned distant horizons in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, never wavered from the judge's face. There was no anger in those eyes, no defiance, just a quiet steadiness that spoke of a man who had weathered far worse storms than this one. "Your Honor," Thomas said quietly, "I'm simply trying to tell you what happened on the morning my home was destroyed." "Your home?" Judge Blake's laugh was sharp and bitter. "A tent on public land is not a home, Mr. Mitchell. A home is something you earn through hard work and personal responsibility. A home is something you buy or rent through legitimate means. What you had was a campsite, and an illegal one at that." He leaned back in his chair, taking the classes, caught the fluorescent light. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want a simple yes or no answer. Were you or were you not living illegally on property that belonged to Grandview Development Corporation?" The question settled over the courtroom like a challenge thrown down in an Old West saloon. Thomas looked at the judge for a long moment, then at Amanda Chen, whose encouraging nod seemed to say, "Tell them what you came here to tell them." But before Thomas could answer, before he could begin to explain about the memorial designation of the land, about the questionable circumstances of its sale to Grandview, about the promises made to the city council that had never been kept, Judge Blake was already moving on. "Let me save us all some time," the judge said, shuffling through the papers on his bench. "This case is exactly what I expected it to be, a waste of the court's time and the taxpayers' money. Miss Chen, your clients were trespassing, simple and plain. The fact that they're now seeking compensation for the lawful removal of their illegal encampment is nothing short of frivolous." In the gallery, one of the court reporters had quietly slipped out of the room, her phone already in her hand. She had covered hundreds of hearings in this courthouse, but she had never seen a judge display such open contempt for a witness. This was news, and her editor would want to know about it immediately. What none of them knew, not the Judge Blake in his self-righteous fury, not Amanda Chen in her growing outrage, not even Thomas Mitchell himself, was that the reporter's phone call would set in motion a chain of events that would transform this routine Tuesday morning into something none of them would ever forget.
The rain continued to drum against the windows, and the fluorescent lights continued their angry buzzing. But the atmosphere in Courtroom 7A had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a simple property dispute was becoming something else entirely. A collision between assumptions and reality, between prejudice and truth, between the comfortable certainties of power and the uncomfortable complexities of justice. And Thomas Mitchell sat in the witness chair, waiting patiently for his chance to speak, carrying with him a story that would soon shake the very foundations of Judge Harrison Blake's carefully ordered world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Judge Blake's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack that seemed to punctuate his dismissive attitude. "Ms. Chen, if you're going to continue with this charade, please make it quick. I have actual cases to hear today." Amanda Chen felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. She had graduated from law school with honors, had clerked for a respected federal judge, and had chosen to work for legal aid because she believed in justice for those who couldn't afford it. She wasn't about to let an arrogant judge intimidate her into abandoning her client. "Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell has relevant testimony about the circumstances of the eviction and the historical significance of the Riverside Parkland. If the court would allow him to complete his answers—" "The historical significance," Judge Blake interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ms. Chen, this is a civil court, not a history classroom. We're here to determine whether Grandview Development Corporation acted within its legal rights, not to listen to campfire stories about the good old days." He turned his attention back to Thomas, who remained seated in the witness chair with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the verbal assault. "Mr. Mitchell, let me be absolutely clear about something. I don't care if you claim to be a war hero or a decorated veteran or the ghost of General Patton himself. What matters in this courtroom are facts, evidence, and the law. Do you understand that?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I understand facts and evidence very well." "Good. Then perhaps you can explain to this court why you and your companions felt entitled to establish what was essentially a shanty town on property that didn't belong to you." Amanda Chen started to object to the characterization, but Thomas spoke first, his voice carrying a quiet authority that somehow commanded attention despite the hostile environment. "Your Honor, the land in question has a complicated history. In 1943, the Riverside Park area was deeded to the city of Hamilton specifically as a memorial park to honor local servicemen who died in World War II. The deed included specific covenants about the land's use and maintenance." Judge Blake waved his hand impatiently. "Ancient history, as I said. Property changes hands, Mr. Mitchell. Deeds get modified. The city sold that land to Grandview Development in 2019 through proper legal channels." "With respect, sir, that's exactly the issue," Thomas continued, unfazed by the judge's interruption. "The original deed contained what's called a reverter clause. If the land ceased to be used as a memorial park, ownership would revert to the heirs of the original donors, the Hamilton family, for whom this county is named." For the first time since the hearing began, Judge Blake looked genuinely surprised. He glanced down at the case file, then at the opposing counsel's table, where Robert Steinberg, Grandview's attorney, sat in an expensive suit looking suddenly uncomfortable. "Mr. Steinberg," Judge Blake said, "is the witness correct about this reverter clause?" Steinberg cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, while there may have been some archaic language in the original deed, the city's legal department thoroughly vetted the sale to my client. Any such provisions would have been superseded by subsequent municipal actions and the passage of time." Thomas turned slightly in his chair to face the corporate attorney. "Mr. Steinberg, with respect, statute of limitations doesn't apply to reverter clauses in memorial dedications. The Hamilton family never relinquished their reversionary interest, and the city never formally changed the land's designation from memorial park to developable property." The courtroom fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Amanda Chen stared at her client in amazement. This was information she hadn't fully grasped during their preparation sessions. Thomas had mentioned the land's history, but she hadn't realized the depth of his legal knowledge. Judge Blake removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, his mind racing. This homeless vagrant was speaking with the precision of a property law expert, citing legal concepts that most people, including some attorneys, couldn't properly explain. "Mr. Mitchell," he said carefully, "where exactly did you acquire this detailed knowledge of property law?" Thomas's expression didn't change. "I've had a lot of time to research, Your Honor. When someone destroys your home, you tend to look into whether they had the right to do it." "Your home," Judge Blake repeated, his sarcasm returning. "We're back to calling a tent on public land your home." "Your Honor," and for the first time, a slight edge crept into Thomas's voice. "For 8 months, that tent was where I slept, where I kept my belongings, where I tried to rebuild my life after circumstances beyond my control left me with nowhere else to go. It may not fit your definition of a home, but it was mine." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the witness with new interest.
There was something about Thomas Mitchell that didn't fit the usual profile of the homeless individuals who occasionally found their way into his courtroom. The man's vocabulary, his posture, his calm confidence in the face of hostility, it all suggested depths that Judge Blake hadn't initially recognized. "These circumstances you mention," the judge said, "perhaps you'd care to elaborate on how a man with your apparent education ended up living in a tent." Amanda Chen recognized the trap immediately. Judge Blake was trying to get Thomas to reveal personal information that could be used to discredit him, to find some character flaw or poor decision that would justify dismissing his testimony. But Thomas seemed to understand the game as well. "Your Honor, my personal circumstances are less relevant than the legal issues surrounding the land. The question before this court isn't how I became homeless. It's whether Grandview Development Corporation had clear legal title to the property they developed." "I'll decide what's relevant in my courtroom," Judge Blake snapped, his authority challenged by the witness's deflection. "You've made claims about property law and historical deeds. You've positioned yourself as something of an expert. I think the court has a right to know what qualifies you to make such claims." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Amanda Chen gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles were white. In the gallery, the handful of spectators leaned forward, sensing that this exchange was building towards something significant. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes focused on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to pull everyone in the room toward him. "Your Honor, I spent 22 years in the United States Army. During that time, I was deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan 3 times. I served as a logistics coordinator, which required extensive knowledge of property law, particularly regarding requisition and use of foreign land for military bases and supply routes." He paused, his hands still folded calmly in his lap. "After my military service, I used my GI Bill benefits to earn a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in public administration. I worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs for 8 years, specializing in property and housing issues for homeless veterans." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Judge Blake seemed momentarily speechless. Thomas continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "I lost my position at the VA during budget cuts 3 years ago. Despite my qualifications and experience, I was unable to find comparable employment. My unemployment benefits ran out, I exhausted my savings, and eventually lost my apartment. That's how I ended up in Riverside Park, Your Honor. Not because I'm lazy or irresponsible, but because sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, no matter how hard you work or how well you prepare." The judge's face had gone through several color changes during this recitation, settling on a pale shade that matched his silver hair. He had expected to expose a fraud or a malingerer. Instead, he had uncovered a man whose credentials were more impressive than most of the attorneys who appeared in his courtroom. "You're telling this court," Judge Blake said slowly, "that you're a decorated veteran with a master's degree who worked for the federal government for 8 years?" "Yes, sir. I have documentation of my service record, my education, and my employment history. Miss Chen has copies in her case file." Amanda Chen nodded quickly, fumbling through her papers. She pulled out a folder and held it up. "Your Honor, all of Mr. Mitchell's credentials have been verified. His military service record shows multiple commendations, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. His academic transcripts show he graduated magna cum laude from State University, and his employment record with the VA is exemplary." Judge Blake stared at the folder as if it contained explosive devices. The narrative he had constructed in his mind, the story of a worthless vagrant trying to scam the system, was crumbling before his eyes. But rather than acknowledge his error, rather than show the humility that the situation demanded, Judge Blake doubled down on his hostility. It was a character flaw that had served him poorly throughout his career, but had never before been so publicly exposed. "Mr. Mitchell, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "If you're as qualified as you claim, then your current situation is even more inexcusable. A man with your alleged background should be able to find employment, should be able to contribute to society instead of living off the charity of others and squatting on private property." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but his expression remained unchanged. He had endured far worse than verbal assault from a petty tyrant in a black robe. "Your Honor, finding employment at my age with a 3-year gap in my work history has proven more challenging than I anticipated. I apply for positions daily. I've had dozens of interviews. The fact that I haven't yet found suitable employment doesn't mean I haven't tried." "Or maybe," suggested Judge Blake with a cruel smile, "your alleged qualifications aren't as impressive as you claim. Maybe you're just another case of stolen valor, trying to trade on the service of better men to gain sympathy from bleeding-heart lawyers and naive judges." The tension in the courtroom felt like a fist to the gut. Amanda Chen shot to her feet, her professional composure finally cracking. "Your Honor, that's completely inappropriate. Mr. Mitchell's service record has been verified through official military channels. You're way out of line." "I'll thank you not to tell me what's appropriate in my own courtroom, Counselor, and I'll remind you that you're one outburst away from being held in contempt." But the damage was done. In the gallery, several people were openly staring at the judge in disbelief. The court reporter's fingers flew over her keys, capturing every word of what was quickly becoming a judicial meltdown. Thomas Mitchell remained in the witness chair, unmoved by the storm swirling around him. He had faced enemy fire, had held dying friends in his arms, had watched his career and his life fall apart through no fault of his own. He wasn't about to be broken by the tantrums of a small-minded man drunk on his own power. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority, "I didn't come here today to be insulted or to have my service questioned. I came here to testify about what happened to my home and the homes of 11 other people who were living in Riverside Park. If you're not interested in hearing that testimony, then perhaps this hearing should be postponed until a time when the court is prepared to conduct itself with the dignity this matter deserves." The challenge was unmistakable. Thomas Mitchell, homeless veteran and alleged vagrant, had just called out a sitting judge for his unprofessional conduct, and he had done it with a quiet dignity that made Judge Blake's blustering seem even more pathetic by comparison. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting to see how Judge Blake would respond to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside Courtroom 7A, a storm of a different kind was just beginning to build. In the back row of Courtroom 7A, a young man named Marcus Rodriguez had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm. At 26, Marcus was a third-year law student at Hamilton University, serving as an intern for the Hamilton County Public Defender's Office. His supervisor had sent him to observe various court proceedings as part of his practical education in criminal and civil law. Marcus had arrived at the courthouse that morning expecting to observe routine proceedings, perhaps a few DUI cases, some small claims disputes, maybe a domestic relations hearing. Instead, he found himself witnessing what appeared to be a complete breakdown of judicial decorum and professional ethics. His smartphone lay in his lap, its screen displaying the voice memo app he'd been using to take notes. Initially, he'd planned to record his observations for the report he'd have to write for his supervising attorney. But as Judge Blake's behavior became increasingly erratic and hostile, Marcus realized he was documenting something far more significant than a routine court hearing. Marcus had grown up in Hamilton County, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to put him through college. His father had served in the Marine Corps before becoming a citizen, and Marcus had deep respect for military service. Watching Judge Blake attack a homeless veteran with such venom made his stomach turn. The confrontation between Thomas Mitchell and Judge Blake had reached a crescendo, with the veteran's quiet challenge hanging in the courtroom air like an unexploded bomb. Marcus could see the shock on the faces of the other spectators, the stunned expression of the court reporter, and the barely controlled rage of Amanda Chen. But it was Thomas Mitchell himself who captured Marcus's attention. Despite the verbal assault, despite having his service questioned and his integrity attacked, the man remained composed. There was something in his bearing and the way he held himself that reminded Marcus of his father, a quiet strength forged in places most people couldn't imagine. Judge Blake's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Mr. Mitchell, your impertinence is noted. This court doesn't require lectures on dignity from squatters and vagrants, regardless of their alleged credentials." Marcus's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, switching from the voice memo app to his contacts. He scrolled through the numbers until he found the one he was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, U.S. Army Reserve. She was his constitutional law professor and a weekend warrior who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a JAG officer. He typed, "Professor Santos, emergency situation at County Courthouse. Judge Blake publicly humiliating homeless veteran, questioning his service record. Thomas Mitchell claims 22 years Army, multiple deployments. This is bad. What should I do?" Marcus hit send and immediately began composing another message, this one to his supervisor at the public defender's office. If this hearing continued on its current trajectory, someone needed to be prepared to file ethics complaints and possibly request judicial review. On the witness stand, Thomas Mitchell was speaking again, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to command attention despite the hostile environment. "Your Honor, I understand that you have preconceptions about homeless individuals. I understand that it's easier to dismiss us as failures or freeloaders than to acknowledge the complex circumstances that can lead anyone, even decorated veterans, to lose everything." He paused, his blue eyes meeting Judge Blake's directly. "But I also understand that this court has a responsibility to hear evidence and make decisions based on facts, rather than prejudice. The question before you today isn't whether you approve of my current living situation. The question is whether Grandview Development Corporation had clear legal title to the Riverside Park property when they demolished our camp." Judge Blake's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "Mr. Mitchell, your situation, whatever the circumstances, doesn't give you or anyone else the right to occupy private property without permission." Marcus's phone buzzed with a response from Professor Santos. "On my way to courthouse. Don't let that veteran leave the building. Recording everything?" Marcus looked around the courtroom and noticed that he wasn't the only one documenting the proceedings. A woman in the gallery whom he recognized as a reporter for the Hamilton County Herald was furiously taking notes. Near the front, the court reporter's fingers were flying over her stenotype machine, capturing every word of what was becoming an increasingly surreal hearing. At the plaintiff's table, Amanda Chen was rifling through her files, clearly searching for the documentation that would support Thomas's claims about the property's legal status. Her initial case strategy had focused on the humanitarian aspects of the eviction, but Thomas's testimony was opening new legal avenues she hadn't fully explored. "Miss Chen," Judge Blake said sharply, "does your client have actual evidence to support these claims about reverter clauses and illegal transfers, or is this just more grandstanding?" Amanda looked up from her files, holding a thick folder. "Your Honor, we have copies of the original 1943 deed, the Hamilton family correspondence regarding the memorial designation, and City Council minutes from 2019 that show the sale to Grandview was approved without proper legal review of the existing encumbrances." She stood and approached the bench. "We also have affidavits from 2 local historians confirming that the Riverside Park area was never formally redesignated from memorial use, and an opinion letter from a property law expert stating that the reverter clause remains in effect." Judge Blake snatched the documents from her hands and began scanning them with increasing irritation.
Marcus could see his face cycling through various expressions: surprise, confusion, and what looked like genuine concern. The documents Amanda had presented weren't the hastily assembled paperwork of a desperate legal aid case. They were thorough, professionally prepared, and appeared to raise serious questions about Grandview's title to the property. Robert Steinberg, Grandview's attorney, was also looking increasingly uncomfortable. He huddled with a younger associate who had been taking notes throughout the hearing, their whispered conversation growing more animated as Judge Blake continued reading. Marcus's phone buzzed again with another message from Professor Santos. Contacted Judge Advocate General's office. They're pulling Thomas Mitchell's service record now. If Judge is questioning his military service publicly, this could become a federal issue. The implications hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. If Professor Santos was involving the JAG Corps, this was escalating beyond a simple civil hearing. Questioning a veteran's service record in open court without evidence could constitute defamation, and if Judge Blake's conduct was sufficiently egregious, it might warrant federal oversight. Thomas Mitchell remained in the witness chair, watching the legal machinery grinding around him with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. Marcus studied his face and saw no anxiety, no desperation, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was telling the truth. "Your Honor," Steinberg finally spoke up, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "my client requests a brief recess to review these new documents and consult with our title insurance company." Judge Blake looked up from the papers, his earlier bluster replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like uncertainty. "Mr. Steinberg, are you telling me that your client developed property without conducting a thorough title search?" "Not at all, Your Honor, but some of these historical documents weren't part of the standard title examination. If there are questions about encumbrances or reversionary interests, we need time to research them properly." The admission hung in the courtroom air like smoke. Grandview Development Corporation, despite its expensive legal representation, apparently hadn't done their homework before building on the Riverside Park property. Marcus saw Thomas Mitchell's expression shift almost imperceptibly, not to satisfaction or vindication, but to something that looked like recognition. It was the expression of a man who had seen this kind of institutional overconfidence before, who had watched powerful people make assumptions that came back to haunt them. Amanda Chen seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is exactly why Mr. Mitchell and the other residents deserve to have their testimony heard completely. They're not just homeless individuals who were inconvenienced by an eviction. They're potential victims of an illegal development project that displaced them from public memorial land." Judge Blake set the documents down heavily, his face a mask of frustration. The simple vagrancy case he had expected to dismiss in 15 minutes had morphed into a complex property law dispute with potential federal implications. But rather than acknowledge his error in prejudging the case, rather than apologize for his treatment of Thomas Mitchell, Judge Blake chose to dig deeper into his defensive position. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "your client may have raised some interesting legal questions, but that doesn't excuse the fact that he and his companions were living in unsanitary conditions on public property, creating health hazards and disturbing the peace." Marcus felt his phone vibrate with an incoming call. The display showed Professor Santos's number. He quickly stood and slipped out of the courtroom into the marble hallway, where the echo of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. "Professor Santos?" "Marcus, I'm 5 minutes away from the courthouse. The JAG office confirmed that Thomas Andrew Mitchell served with distinction for 22 years. Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge, the works. If a judge is publicly questioning this man's service record, we have a serious problem." Marcus could hear the engine noise of a car in the background. "Professor, it's worse than I texted you. The judge has been hostile from the beginning, but now it looks like there might be real legal issues with the property development. The veteran isn't just some random homeless guy. He seems to know more about property law than most lawyers."
"That makes sense," Professor Santos replied. According to his record, Mitchell specialized in logistics and property acquisition during his overseas deployments. He also has a master's degree in public administration and worked for the VA for 8 years. This judge picked the wrong veteran to humiliate. Marcus heard the sound of car doors slamming in the background. "Marcus, I'm in the courthouse lobby. Which courtroom?" 7A, second floor. "Professor, there's something else.
I think other people are documenting this. There's a reporter here, and I saw someone else recording with their phone. Good. The more witnesses, the better. This is going to end badly for Judge Blake, and that veteran deserves to have his dignity restored. Marcus ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment, processing what he had just learned. Thomas Mitchell wasn't just a decorated veteran. He was exactly the kind of person who would understand the legal complexities of property development and municipal authority. His testimony wasn't the rambling of a desperate homeless man. It was the informed analysis of someone who had spent decades working with property law in military and civilian contexts. Through the courtroom doors, Marcus could hear Judge Blake's voice rising again, apparently unsatisfied with the morning's level of conflict. He took a deep breath and pushed through the doors, returning to his seat just as Professor Santos's footsteps echoed in the marble hallway outside. The storm that had been building in Courtroom 7A was about to get much more complicated, and Marcus had a front-row seat to what was shaping up to be a complete judicial meltdown. Thomas Mitchell sat in the witness chair, still waiting patiently for his chance to complete his testimony, unaware that help was about to arrive in the form of a constitutional law professor with direct connections to the United States Army. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos stood in the marble lobby of the Hamilton County Courthouse, her civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish the bearing that marked her as military. At 42, she had learned to navigate two worlds: the academic environment of Hamilton University, where she taught constitutional law 3 days a week, and the military justice system, where she served as a reserve JAG officer on weekends and during deployments. Her phone was pressed to her ear as she spoke in crisp, professional tones to someone at the Pentagon. Colonel Williams, I need you to understand that this isn't just about one homeless veteran being mistreated. If the facts are as described, we have a sitting judge publicly questioning the service record of a decorated combat veteran without any evidence of fraud. She paused, listening to the response, her eyes scanning the courthouse directory on the wall. Yes, sir, I understand the separation between civilian and military justice. But when a federal veteran is being defamed in open court based solely on his current housing status, that crosses into our jurisdiction. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Colonel David Williams, Chief of Military Justice at the Pentagon. Santos had served under him during her deployment to Afghanistan, and she knew he would take this situation seriously. Maria, you said the veteran's name is Thomas Mitchell. What's his service record look like? 22 years active duty, multiple combat deployments, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, exemplary service record. He worked logistics and property acquisition, which explains why he knows so much about the legal issues in this case. And the judge is questioning his service record publicly? According to my student, yes. The judge accused him of stolen valor in open court, called his credentials fraudulent, and suggested he was trading on the service of better men. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Colonel Williams spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command authority. Maria, I'm escalating this to General Patricia Hayes at the Department of Veterans Affairs. She's been looking for high-profile cases to demonstrate the military's commitment to protecting veteran dignity. This sounds like exactly what she's been waiting for. Santos felt a chill run down her spine. General Hayes was a 3-star general who had made veteran advocacy her personal mission after retiring from active duty. If she got involved in this case, the political implications would extend far beyond one courthouse in Hamilton County. Sir, are you sure we want to escalate this that far? It's still a developing situation. Maria, you've served in combat. You know what it means when someone questions a veteran's service record without justification. This judge has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. General Hayes needs to know about this immediately.
The call ended, and Santos stood in the courthouse lobby, processing the magnitude of what she had just set in motion. What had started as a law student's concerned text message was rapidly becoming a federal case with implications that reached the highest levels of military leadership. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Judge getting worse. Threatening contempt charges now. Thomas still calm, but situation escalating." Santos headed for the elevator, her mind racing through the potential consequences of the next hour. She had seen judicial misconduct before, but rarely involving such a clear-cut case of prejudice against a veteran. Judge Blake had apparently chosen the worst possible target for his hostility. 3 floors above, in a corner office of the federal building across the street, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes was ending her own phone call with Colonel Williams. At 55, General Hayes had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to veteran advocacy work. Her office walls were covered in commendations, photographs with world leaders, and letters from veterans whose lives had been transformed by her interventions.
But it was the small framed photograph on her desk that drove her daily mission. A picture of her younger brother, Michael, a Marine who had returned from Vietnam to face the same kind of public hostility and prejudice that Thomas Mitchell was experiencing in Courtroom 7A. Michael Hayes had been spat on at airports, called a baby killer by protesters, and denied jobs because of his military service. He had eventually taken his own life in 1978, unable to reconcile his service to his country with his country's rejection of his sacrifice. General Hayes had dedicated her life to ensuring that no other veteran would face such abandonment. "Major Thompson," she called to her aide in the outer office, "get me General Marcus Stewart at Fort Benning. Tell him it's urgent." Major Thompson appeared in the doorway, notepad in hand. "Yes, ma'am. Should I mention the nature of the call?" "Tell him we have a veteran dignity issue in Hamilton County. A sitting judge is publicly defaming a decorated combat veteran. General Stewart will understand the implications." As Major Thompson hurried to place the call, General Hayes turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. If this situation was as serious as Colonel Williams had described, she needed to mobilize resources immediately. The military's response to civilian prejudice against veterans had to be swift, decisive, and highly visible. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she drafted messages to key personnel across the military hierarchy. This wasn't just about one veteran. It was about sending a message that the United States military would not tolerate the public humiliation of its members, active or retired. Back in Courtroom 7A, the situation continued to deteriorate. Judge Blake had denied Steinberg's request for a recess and was now conducting what amounted to a personal interrogation of Thomas Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you claim to have served with distinction, yet here you are, homeless and living off charity. How do you reconcile those two facts?" Thomas remained perfectly composed, his hands folded in his lap. "Your Honor, military service doesn't guarantee immunity from life's challenges. Economic downturns, budget cuts, health issues, family crises, these things can affect anyone regardless of their service record. So you're telling me that despite 22 years of military training, despite your alleged advanced education, despite your supposed expertise in property law, you're completely unable to support yourself?" Amanda Chen shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is completely irrelevant to the property dispute before this court. Mr. Mitchell's personal financial situation has no bearing on the legal issues regarding Grandview's title to the Riverside Park property." Judge Blake's face flushed red. "Miss Chen, I've warned you about interrupting my questioning. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt,"
Amanda shot back, her professional restraint finally snapping. "Because what you're doing to this man is a disgrace to the judicial system. You're not conducting a hearing, you're conducting a character assassination." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Marcus Rodriguez gripped his phone, continuing to record while frantically texting updates to Professor Santos. The reporter from the Hamilton County Herald was scribbling notes so rapidly that her pen was becoming a blur. Judge Blake's gavel crashed down repeatedly. "Order! Order in this courtroom! Miss Chen, you are held in contempt. Bailiff, remove this attorney from my courtroom immediately." But before the bailiff could move, the courtroom doors swung open with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos entered, her bearing unmistakably military despite her civilian clothes. She carried a briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, and her expression suggested that she was prepared for battle. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I request permission to approach the bench as a representative of the United States Army Reserve and as an officer of this court." Judge Blake looked up, momentarily thrown off balance by the interruption. "This is a civil hearing, ma'am. I don't know who you are, but you have no standing in this proceeding." Santos reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather credential case. "Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Army Reserve. I also hold a license to practice law in this state, which gives me standing to observe these proceedings and to file formal complaints if necessary." She approached the bench with measured steps, her credentials held out for inspection. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe that this court is conducting improper questioning of a decorated United States Army veteran. Under federal law, veterans have certain protections against harassment and defamation based on their military service." Judge Blake's face went through several color changes as he examined Santos's credentials. The situation was spiraling completely out of his control, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "Colonel Santos, this is still my courtroom, and I don't appreciate military personnel attempting to interfere with civilian judicial proceedings." Santos's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a new edge. "Your Honor, I'm not here to interfere. I'm here to observe and to ensure that Sergeant First Class Mitchell's rights under federal veteran protection statutes are not violated." The correction in Thomas's rank hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos had just revealed that she knew Thomas Mitchell's exact military rank and was prepared to defend his service record with the full authority of the United States Army. Thomas looked up at Santos with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. For months he had been invisible, dismissed, ignored. Now, for the first time since his life had fallen apart, someone with authority was standing up for him.
Judge Blake stared at the credentials in his hand, then at Lieutenant Colonel Santos, then at Thomas Mitchell. The homeless vagrant he had been systematically humiliating for the past hour was apparently important enough to warrant intervention by a senior military officer. "Colonel Santos," he said carefully, "what exactly is your interest in this proceeding?" Santos's reply was crisp and professional. "My interest, Your Honor, is ensuring that a veteran who served his country with distinction is treated with the respect and dignity that all Americans deserve in a court of law, regardless of their current circumstances." She turned slightly to face Thomas Mitchell, and for the first time since the hearing began, someone in authority looked at him with respect rather than contempt. "Sergeant First Class Mitchell," she said, "thank you for your service to our country." The simple acknowledgement seemed to fill the courtroom with a different kind of energy. Thomas nodded slightly, his composed facade showing the first crack of emotion he had displayed all morning. But Lieutenant Colonel Santos was just the advance guard. At that very moment, General Hayes was stepping into a black sedan outside the federal building, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated a response that would transform this local courthouse drama into a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. The storm that had been building in Courtroom 7A was about to become a hurricane, and Judge Harrison Blake was standing directly in its path. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Santos had fundamentally altered the dynamics in Courtroom 7A, but Judge Blake was too deep into his pattern of hostility to recognize the warning signs. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his confrontational approach, apparently believing that his judicial authority superseded any military intervention. "Colonel Santos," he said carefully, "what exactly is your interest in this proceeding?" Santos's reply was crisp and professional. "My interest, Your Honor, is ensuring that a veteran who served his country with distinction is treated with the respect and dignity that all Americans deserve in a court of law, regardless of their current circumstances." She turned slightly to face Thomas Mitchell, and for the first time since the hearing began, someone in authority looked at him with respect rather than contempt. "Sergeant First Class Mitchell," she said, "thank you for your service to our country." The simple acknowledgement seemed to fill the courtroom with a different kind of energy. Thomas nodded slightly, his composed facade showing the first crack of emotion he had displayed all morning. But Lieutenant Colonel Santos was just the advance guard. At that very moment, General Hayes was stepping into a black sedan outside the federal building, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated a response that would transform this local courthouse drama into a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. The storm that had been building in Courtroom 7A was about to become a hurricane, and Judge Harrison Blake was standing directly in its path. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Santos had fundamentally altered the dynamics in Courtroom 7A, but Judge Blake was too deep into his pattern of hostility to recognize the warning signs. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his confrontational approach, apparently believing that his judicial authority superseded any military intervention. "Colonel Santos," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "I appreciate your concern for this witness, but I will not have my courtroom turned into a military tribunal. You may observe, but you will not interfere with my questioning." Santos took a seat in the front row, directly behind the plaintiff's table, her presence a stark reminder that this hearing was no longer just a local civil matter. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she documented every word of the proceedings. Judge Blake turned his attention back to Thomas Mitchell, who remained in the witness chair with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the ordeal. The judge's earlier confidence had been shaken by Santos's intervention, but his pride prevented him from acknowledging his errors. "Mr. Mitchell," he continued, emphasizing the civilian title rather than Thomas's military rank, "let's return to the facts. You and your companions were living illegally on property that belonged to Grandview Development. When you were ordered to leave, you refused. These are the facts, correct?" Thomas's response was measured and precise. "Your Honor, those are some of the facts, but not all of them. The legal status of the property is in dispute, which is why we're here today. If Grandview didn't have clear title, then we weren't trespassing." If, Judge Blake mocked. "Mr. Mitchell, the law doesn't operate on hypotheticals. Grandview had a deed. They had legal title. That's what matters." Amanda Chen, who had been watching the exchange with growing frustration, stood up with a thick folder in her hands. "Your Honor, may I present additional evidence regarding the property title?" Judge Blake waved dismissively. "Miss Chen, you've already submitted your documents. I don't need to see more paperwork trying to muddy clear legal waters." "Your Honor," Amanda pressed, "these are City Council minutes from 1943 through 2019, showing that the memorial designation was never formally removed. We also have correspondence from the Hamilton family's estate attorney, dated last month, formally objecting to the development and asserting their reversionary rights." The mention of recent legal action from the Hamilton family caused a visible stir in the courtroom.
Robert Steinberg, Grandview's attorney, looked genuinely alarmed for the first time since the hearing began. "Your Honor," Steinberg interjected, "this is the first we're hearing of any challenge from the Hamilton estate. If such a claim exists, it should have been raised during the title examination process." Judge Blake's irritation was now directed at both attorneys. "Mr. Steinberg, are you telling me your client didn't conduct proper due diligence before developing this property?" "Of course we conducted due diligence, Your Honor, but if there are parties claiming reversionary interests who didn't appear in the public records—" "Then maybe," Thomas Mitchell said quietly, his voice cutting through the legal bickering, "Grandview should have asked the people who were actually living on the land before they destroyed our homes." The simple statement hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Thomas had identified the fundamental issue that everyone else was dancing around. Grandview had bulldozed a homeless encampment without bothering to investigate whether the residents might have information relevant to the property's legal status. Judge Blake's face flushed red. "Mr. Mitchell, you were trespassing. Your opinion about property development is irrelevant." "With respect, Your Honor," Thomas replied, "my opinion about property development is based on 8 years of experience with the Department of Veterans Affairs, where I specialized in exactly these kinds of title and zoning issues. I know what questions should be asked before displacing people from their homes." Lieutenant Colonel Santos looked up from her tablet, her expression thoughtful. She had been taking notes not just on Judge Blake's conduct, but on Thomas Mitchell's responses. The man's expertise was becoming more apparent with each exchange, and she was beginning to understand why the Pentagon had taken such immediate interest in this case. "Your Honor," she said, standing up, "may I respectfully suggest that Sergeant First Class Mitchell be allowed to complete his testimony without further interruption. His expertise appears to be directly relevant to the legal issues before this court."
Judge Blake's jaw clenched visibly. "Colonel Santos, I've already told you that this is not a military proceeding. Your use of military rank is inappropriate in a civilian court." Santos's response was calm but firm. "Your Honor, using a veteran's proper military rank is a matter of respect, not jurisdiction. Sergeant First Class Mitchell earned that rank through 22 years of distinguished service. Referring to him by his correct title costs nothing and honors his sacrifice." The exchange highlighted the fundamental divide that had emerged in the courtroom. On one side stood Judge Blake, clinging to his civilian authority and his prejudices about homeless individuals. On the other side stood Lieutenant Colonel Santos and, by extension, the entire United States military, insisting that Thomas Mitchell be treated with the dignity his service had earned. Marcus Rodriguez, still documenting everything from the back row, watched the confrontation with growing amazement. His constitutional law textbooks had covered judicial misconduct and military-civilian relations, but he had never imagined witnessing such a direct conflict between judicial and military authority. His phone buzzed with another text from Professor Santos. "More help coming. General Hayes mobilizing full response. Document everything." The message sent a chill down Marcus's spine. If a general was getting involved, this situation was about to escalate beyond anything he could have imagined when he first walked into the courtroom that morning. Judge Blake, apparently oblivious to the forces gathering against him, continued his assault on Thomas Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, let me ask you directly, do you believe that your military service entitles you to ignore civilian law?" The question was clearly designed as a trap, intended to portray Thomas as someone who believed veterans were above the law, but Thomas saw it coming from miles away. "No, Your Honor. My military service taught me to respect the law and to protect the rights of all Americans, including those who can't protect themselves. That's exactly why I'm here today, to testify about the illegal destruction of homes belonging to vulnerable people." "Vulnerable people," Judge Blake repeated mockingly. "Mr. Mitchell,
You were squatters. You were living in violation of municipal codes, creating health hazards and disturbing the peace. There's nothing vulnerable about breaking the law. Thomas's response carried a quiet dignity that made Judge Blake's hostility seem even more petty by comparison. Your Honor, vulnerability isn't about whether someone breaks the law. It's about whether they have the resources to defend themselves when someone more powerful decides to take what little they have. He paused, his pale blue eyes meeting Judge Blake's directly. Every person in that camp was vulnerable. Veterans, disabled individuals, families with children, elderly people with nowhere else to go. We weren't breaking the law maliciously. We were trying to survive. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Thomas's words carried a moral authority that transcended legal arguments and touched something fundamental about justice and human dignity. But Judge Blake was past the point of recognizing moral authority. His pride had been challenged, his assumptions questioned, and his courtroom invaded by military personnel who clearly thought he was wrong. Instead of reflection, he chose escalation. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice rising to a dangerous whisper, "you seem to have a very high opinion of your own expertise. Perhaps you'd like to explain to this court how someone with such vast knowledge of the law ended up living in a tent."
The personal attack was so blatant, so inappropriate, that it drew gasps from the gallery. Lieutenant Colonel Santos's fingers flew across her tablet, documenting what was clearly a violation of judicial ethics. Marcus Rodriguez gripped his phone, continuing to record what was rapidly becoming a complete judicial meltdown. Thomas Mitchell sat in the witness chair, absorbing the verbal blow with the same composure he had maintained throughout the morning. He had faced enemy fire, had held dying comrades in his arms, had watched his career and his life fall apart through circumstances beyond his control. He wasn't going to be broken by the tantrums of a petty tyrant in a black robe. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "knowledge doesn't protect you from life's circumstances. Neither does military service, advanced education, or years of government experience. Sometimes, despite your best efforts and preparations, everything falls apart. The measure of a man isn't whether he avoids hardship, it's how he responds when hardship finds him." The response was delivered with such quiet dignity, such obvious truth that it seemed to suck all the air out of Judge Blake's sails. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. The only sound the steady drumming of rain against the windows. But the silence was about to be broken by footsteps in the hallway outside. Footsteps that belonged to people with enough authority to end Judge Blake's reign of terror once and for all. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 7A opened with a deliberate, measured push that immediately commanded the attention of every person in the chamber. The sound was not dramatic, no theatrical flourish or sudden bang, but there was something in the quiet authority of that opening that made everyone turn. A woman in an immaculate army dress blue uniform stepped through the doorway. Her bearing was unmistakably command presence, the kind that came from years of leading troops in combat zones and high-stakes military operations. On her shoulders, 4 silver stars caught the fluorescent light, identifying her as a 4-star general. General Hayes paused for a moment in the doorway, her steel-gray eyes surveying the scene before her. She took in Judge Blake's flushed face, Thomas Mitchell's composed dignity in the witness chair, Lieutenant Colonel Santos standing at attention near the plaintiff's table, and the palpable tension that filled the courtroom like smoke. Behind her, 2 more officers entered, a full colonel and a lieutenant colonel, both in dress uniform, both carrying themselves with the same quiet authority that marked them as senior military leaders. They took positions along the back wall of the courtroom, standing at parade rest, their presence transforming the civilian courtroom into something that felt distinctly like a military tribunal. Judge Blake looked up from his bench, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process what he was seeing. The morning had begun with what he thought was a simple vagrancy case involving a homeless drifter. Now, apparently, it had escalated to involve multiple high-ranking military officers, including a 4-star general. General Hayes walked down the center aisle with measured steps, her polished shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. Every eye in the courtroom followed her progress as she approached the area where Thomas Mitchell sat in the witness chair. She stopped directly in front of him, turned to face him fully, and then executed the sharpest, most precise military salute that anyone in that courtroom had ever witnessed. Her voice when she spoke carried clearly through the silent chamber, with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing thousands of troops. Sergeant First Class Thomas Andrew Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, I salute your service and sacrifice. The moment stretched out in absolute silence. Thomas Mitchell, homeless veteran and alleged vagrant, looked up at the 4-star general saluting him, and for the first time since the hearing began, his composed facade cracked slightly. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen too much in too many distant places, filled with an emotion that was part gratitude, part relief, and part vindication. He slowly rose from the witness chair, his weathered frame straightening to attention with muscle memory that 22 years of military service had burned into his very bones. He returned the salute with precision that would have made a drill sergeant proud. "Thank you, General," he said quietly. "It's an honor." General Hayes held the salute for a few more seconds before lowering her arm. She turned to face Judge Blake, and when she did, her expression had transformed from respectful recognition to something much colder and more dangerous. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I am General Patricia Hayes, United States Army. I oversee veteran affairs and advocacy for the Department of Defense. I'm here because it has come to my attention that this court has been conducting what can only be described as a systematic attack on a decorated combat veteran." She took a step closer to the bench, her presence filling the courtroom with an energy that was both commanding and threatening. Sergeant First Class Mitchell served his country with distinction for 22 years. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions under enemy fire. He was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. He holds the Combat Infantry Badge, the Expert Infantry Badge, and more than a dozen other military decorations. Her voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in the kind of crescendo that military officers used when addressing large formations. This man carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. This man held defensive positions against overwhelming odds. This man served his country with honor in places that you, Your Honor, cannot even pronounce. The courtroom was dead silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Judge Blake sat frozen in his chair, apparently incapable of responding to the verbal assault from one of the most senior officers in the United States Army. General Hayes continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority. "And yet you have spent this morning mocking his service, questioning his credentials, and treating him like a common criminal because he doesn't currently have a permanent address. You have accused him of stolen valor. You have suggested that he is trading on the service of better men. You have used your position of authority to humiliate and degrade a man who has given more to this country than most people can even imagine." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "Your Honor, I have reviewed Sergeant First Class Mitchell's complete military record. I have spoken with officers who served with him in combat. I can tell you with absolute certainty that there are very few better men than the one sitting in that witness chair.
Marcus Rodriguez, still documenting everything from the back row, watched in amazement as Judge Blake seemed to physically shrink in his chair. The arrogant tyrant who had dominated the courtroom for the past 2 hours was being systematically dismantled by someone with real authority and unquestionable moral standing. Amanda Chen stood at the plaintiff's table, tears streaming down her face as she watched her client finally receive the respect and recognition he deserved. The young attorney had spent months preparing for this case, but she could never have imagined that it would culminate in a 4-star general saluting her homeless client in open court. General Hayes turned back to Thomas Mitchell, her expression softening as she addressed him directly. "Sergeant First Class Mitchell, I want you to know that your service has not been forgotten. The United States Army does not abandon its own, regardless of the circumstances that may have led to your current situation." She reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew an official-looking document. "I am personally authorizing your immediate enrollment in the Army's Comprehensive Veteran Support Program. You will have access to housing, medical care, job placement assistance, and any other services you need to rebuild your life. This is not charity. This is what you have earned through your service to this nation." Thomas Mitchell stared at the document in General Hayes' hand, his composure finally breaking as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. For the first time in months, he was being treated not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a human being worthy of respect and assistance. "General, I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything, Sergeant. Your service speaks for itself." She turned back to Judge Blake, who was still sitting in stunned silence on his bench. "Your Honor, I trust that this court will now treat Sergeant First Class Mitchell with the respect and dignity that all Americans deserve, regardless of their housing status." Judge Blake tried to speak, but no words came out. The morning's events had completely overwhelmed his ability to process what was happening. He had begun the day as the unchallenged authority in his own courtroom. Now he was being lectured on basic human decency by a 4-star general, and he had no idea how to respond. Lieutenant Colonel Santos stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "General Hayes, I've documented the entire proceedings. I believe there are grounds for formal complaints with both the State Judicial Review Board and the Federal Civil Rights Commission." General Hayes nodded grimly. "Colonel Santos, please prepare those complaints immediately. This kind of conduct toward veterans cannot be tolerated, and there must be consequences to ensure it doesn't happen again." She looked around the courtroom, her gaze taking in the reporters, the court personnel, and the few spectators who had witnessed the morning's events. "Let me be clear about something. The United States military will not stand by while veterans are mistreated simply because they have fallen on hard times. Every person who served this country with honor deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and we will intervene whenever and wherever that principle is violated." The promise carried the weight of institutional authority. This wasn't just one general making threats. This was the United States Army serving notice that veteran dignity was a federal priority that would be defended with the full resources of the military establishment. Robert Steinberg, Grandview's attorney, had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm. The property dispute that had brought them to court had been completely overshadowed by the revelation of Thomas Mitchell's background and credentials. He leaned over to whisper urgently to his associate.
"We need to settle this case immediately," he said. "If half of what Mitchell claims about the property title is true, and now we have the entire U.S. Army watching our every move, we're looking at a public relations nightmare that could destroy the company." Amanda Chen, overhearing the whispered conversation, stepped forward. "Your Honor, in light of the morning's revelations, I believe both parties would benefit from a recess to explore settlement negotiations." Judge Blake, still apparently in shock, nodded weakly. "Court is in recess," he managed to say, though his voice was barely audible. As the courtroom began to empty, General Hayes approached Thomas Mitchell one more time. "Sergeant, I want you to know that what happened here today will be investigated thoroughly. No veteran should ever have to endure what you experienced in this courtroom." Thomas stood up from the witness chair, his dignity intact despite the morning's ordeal. "General, I appreciate everything you've done, But I didn't serve my country for recognition or special treatment. I served because it was right. General Hayes smiled, the first warm expression she had shown since entering the courtroom. Sergeant, that attitude is exactly why you deserve both recognition and special treatment. Heroes rarely ask for what they've earned, which is precisely why the rest of us have to make sure they receive it. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell was working as a property law consultant for the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping other homeless veterans navigate the complex legal issues that often contributed to their displacement. The Riverside Park case had been settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with Grandview Development Corporation agreeing to fund a permanent housing facility for homeless veterans in Hamilton County. Judge Harrison Blake had resigned from the bench after the State Judicial Review Board found that his conduct violated multiple canons of judicial ethics. The video of General Hayes saluting Thomas Mitchell had gone viral, becoming a symbol of the respect and dignity that all veterans deserved. And in a small office in the federal building across from the courthouse where his ordeal had taken place, Sergeant First Class Thomas Andrew Mitchell worked each day to ensure that no other veteran would face the kind of prejudice and humiliation he had endured. He had found his purpose again, not in spite of his experience as a homeless veteran, but because of it. The measure of a man, he had learned, wasn't whether he avoided hardship. It was how he used that hardship to serve others who faced the same struggles. And by that measure, Thomas Mitchell had finally found his way home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.